Two American service members, standing guard in the nation's capital, were shot point-blank in a cold-blooded ambush. This was not random violence. This was a deliberate, targeted execution attempt less than a mile from the White House. The suspect was not merely an immigrant. He was an Afghan national flown into the country under a massive governmental rush program, and tonight, officials confirm he had direct, high-level intelligence ties. A fundamental trust has been violated. How did a man with links to CIA-backed units in a conflict zone slip through our airtight security and come within inches of killing American soldiers on U.S. soil? We uncovered the full story. Stay with us as we break this down in our in-depth discussion right here on News Focus Podcast. And if you find our reporting valuable, please hit the like button and subscribe to support our channel. We truly appreciate it. So let's just dive right into the sources. We're looking at an event in Washington, D.C. that really went from being a local crime story to a full-blown national security crisis in a matter of hours.
And it's important to stress right at the top that this wasn't, as some of the initial chatter suggested, some sort of, a misunderstanding or community tension.
Right.
No, the reports we've reviewed, they're very clear. Witness accounts, investigative follow-ups, they all point to the same conclusion. This was an ambush.
Sudden, violent, and intentional.
Exactly. The picture they paint is, well, it's terrifying. These two National Guardsmen are just standing their post. A routine duty, and they're approached and shot, point blank.
And there was no confrontation leading up to it, no shouting, nothing.
Nothing. That's what's so chilling. The witnesses said there was no warning, no argument. One moment they're on duty, the next they're on the ground bleeding. It was cold.
And the location here is key. This wasn't in some remote area. This was less than a mile from the White House.
Which is precisely why it detonated this immediate national security fear.
You had sirens, lockdowns, helicopters. The entire heart of the Republic went into emergency mode.
Because the fear wasn't just about two men being hurt, as tragic as that is. It was the implication.
An attack on the uniform.
A deliberate attack on our service members in broad daylight, right at the center of American power. That sends a very specific, very dangerous message.
And this is where the story gets even more complicated. Because according to the sources, the response from officials and even parts of the media was, well, let's just say it was telling.
There was a palpable rush, it seems, to control the narrative. We're talking within minutes before the guardsmen were even confirmed to be stable.
The allegation from the sources is that the mainstream media immediately started to run interference. That's a quote.
And what that means, in practice, is that instead of focusing on the cold, hard facts of the attack, the reporting allegedly started to hint at these external factors.
I saw those reports. They were floating ideas like community tension. Some even seemed to be implying that the very presence of the uniforms could have been a provocation.
It's what our sources call a pre-spin, an attempt to shape the public's understanding of the event before the most damaging facts could come out.
Because they knew what was coming. They knew who the perpetrator was.
They must have. Because once his identity was confirmed, this was no longer a story you could spin. It became a story about catastrophic policy failure.
And that confirmation is really the start of our deep dive today.
The suspect was identified as Ramanullah Lakenwal, an Afghan national. And just that fact alone, those two words, Afghan national, completely changed the game.
Because it connected this violent ambush directly to a specific government program.
A program that came with some very big promises. Lakenwal was brought into the United States during Operation Allies Welcome.
The chaotic 2021 evacuation from Kabul.
The very same. And the administration had sold that program to the American people with a very specific slogan. They called it the most thorough vetting process in history.
So the man who just allegedly tried to execute 2 U.S. soldiers came directly from a program that was sold as being completely airtight.
That's the contradiction. And that's when this shifted from a crime story to a story about a systemic governmental failure.
And it just got darker from there.
Much darker. Because the early reporting confirmed something else about Lakenwal's background. He wasn't just some random evacuee.
He had intelligence ties.
Yes, links to CIA-backed units in Afghanistan. So now you're not just talking about a failure in general immigration screening?
No, this is different. This is a high-risk individual. Someone the intelligence community would describe as, what, an asset?
Or at least someone with operational links. He was described in reports as intelligence-linked and military-trained. This is the kind of person who is supposed to get the most scrutiny, not the least.
And that, according to the sources, is why the officials seemed to hesitate for hours before releasing his name.
It seems very likely. They were allegedly dragging their feet. because once that name and that background were public, the connection would be undeniable.
The connection being that this act of violence was a direct result of their oversight.
A direct and, you could argue, a foreseeable consequence of what our sources call a catastrophic immigration failure. The system didn't just fail, it delivered the threat right to the heart of the capital.
Okay, so let's unpack that system. We need to go back to 2021 to really understand how this happened. Talk to us about Operation Allies Welcome, what was promised and what was the reality on the ground.
Operation Allies Welcome was, the scale of it was just monumental. After Kabul fell, you had nearly 90,000 Afghans airlifted into the U.S. in an incredibly short period of time.
A massive undertaking.
Massive. And because of the chaos, the White House was out there constantly reassuring the public about security. They used those slogans repeatedly. The most thorough vetting process in history. That was meant to build public trust.
Okay, that's the slogan. But let's get into the mechanics of it. What does vetting actually mean in this context, and how did the process for OEW differ from, say, the normal process?
That's the critical distinction. We have to separate the standard intended process from what happened in this emergency.
So what's the standard?
Normally, for someone seeking long-term entry, like a special immigrant visa and SIV, you're looking at a multi-year, incredibly rigorous process. Oh, yes. You have to provide proof of continuous employment with U.S. forces. You go through years of deep background checks, multiple interviews with different agencies, and crucially, biometric confirmation, all before you are even authorized to travel.
It's designed to be slow and meticulous.
By design. But Operation Allies Welcome didn't use that SIV pathway.
They use something else.
Correct. They used the Emergency Authority of Humanitarian Parole. And this is a key point for you to understand. Parole allows individuals to enter the U.S. temporarily without meeting the usual visa requirements.
That's a fast track.
It's an emergency fast track. It prioritizes speed and humanitarian concern over that deep, methodical vetting.
And the sources suggest that even for that lower bar, they couldn't clear it.
That's what the internal reports allege. Because of the sheer rush, DHS officials apparently admitted, privately, that they simply could not confirm who was vetted before they got on the planes.
Wait, they couldn't confirm who was vetted?
Or how many. Or even if any real pre-flight checks happened for thousands of people. It was pure chaos.
So the promise of most thorough vetting,
Yeah.
just as a big, it evaporated.
It dissolved into what some sources called a wide-open doorway.
That's some strong language.
The reports are full of it. They call it the express lane, the conveyor belt. The takeaway is that the priority was just raw numbers. Get people out, get them on planes. The focus was speed and volume, not security.
So what checks were they actually doing? Anything.
The process seemed to rely almost exclusively on very basic biometric checks at transit points, like lily pad bases in Europe or the Middle East.
Which is not enough for someone like Lakenwall.
Not even close. For someone with a complex intelligence background, a simple fingerprint check tells you almost nothing about their allegiances, their psychological state, or any potential risks they pose.
And the failure here wasn't just about skipping steps. It was about the data itself, the record keeping.
Yes. For a system to be secure, you need verified data. You need a clean chain of custody for each person's identity.
And they didn't have that.
The sources are pretty clear that in the final crush at the Kabul airport, people were boarding planes without any completed records. Names weren't linked to confirmed biometrics. Background checks were aspirational at best. The data was missing from the very beginning.
This wasn't just a secret internal problem, though. This all came out in Congress, under oath.
It did. And that confrontation back in 2021 was a pivotal moment. This wasn't some leak. This was in the official congressional record.
It was a Senate hearing. And lawmakers asked the Homeland Security Secretary a very simple, very direct question.
A fundamental question of competence. They asked how many evacuees were vetted before they got on the plane. Give us a number.
Not a complicated question.
Should not be. But the response he gave wasn't a number.
It was the slogan.
He fell back on the slogan. It's our policy to vet 100%.
Which is a classic political answer. It's talking about your intention, not the result.
Exactly. It's a way to avoid confirming whether you actually had the capability to execute the policy you're describing. And by doing that, he basically admitted, without admitting it, that they didn't have the data.
But they kept pressing him. They didn't let him get away with the talking point.
They did. They restated the question. We need a number, a verifiable figure. Yes or no, can you provide it?
And what was his final answer?
After being cornered, he finally admitted, I can't speak to that.
I can't speak to that. From the head of the Department of Homeland Security.
The man whose entire job is to know that number. Critics took that as a direct confirmation. The data to back up their safety claims. It just didn't exist. It was a total breakdown in the chain of custody for 90,000 people.
And the follow-up analysis from congressional Republicans was even more blunt.
They concluded that in that final rush, there was only one guiding principle: expediency. Their words were that officials were simply loading planes to capacity.
Loading planes to capacity. That phrase just says it all.
It really does. It paints a picture where volume and speed were the only things that mattered. It suggests there was no consistent process, no guaranteed background checks, and no reliable biometric clearing for every single person.
So the system failed on two levels. First, they chose to use the parole fast track, which already lowered the security bar.
And second, they couldn't even confirm that they consistently met that lower bar.
And now, years later, the sources argued that the brutal consequence of that choice, of that evasion in the Senate hearing, has shown up on the streets of D.C.
As a violent attack on American soldiers, the connection is, it's direct.
So we've laid out the failure of the system, but now we have to zero in on this individual, Emmanuel Lakenwall. Because his background, his intelligence connections, they point to a much deeper failure. This isn't just about chaos.
That's absolutely right. This moves beyond simple bureaucratic incompetence. When you're dealing with someone allegedly connected to CIA-backed paramilitary units, you are in a completely different category of risk.
Explain that for us. What does CIA-backed unit actually mean in terms of the risk profile? What kind of scrutiny should he have received?
These individuals require specialized handling, period. They weren't just translators or drivers. These units were often involved in very high-stakes kinetic operations during the war. They are, by definition, complex individuals who carry inherent risks.
What kind of risks?
Potential for being targeted by enemy groups, for one, but also shifting loyalties, psychological trauma, or even vulnerability to foreign intelligence influence once they're resettled. Their profiles are incredibly sensitive.
So there must be a protocol for this. There has to be an established way to handle people like this.
Of course. And historically, the protocols are intense. For anyone with these kinds of operational intelligence links, the standard process is considered totally insufficient.
So what's required?
Mandated extra scrutiny, deeper, more invasive background reviews. And, this is the most critical part, structured, long-term monitoring once they are in the United States.
Long-term monitoring, you mean like surveillance?
Not necessarily overt surveillance, but a managed relationship. It can include required debriefing schedules, sometimes polygraph exams, and, crucially, being assigned to a specific case officer within the intelligence community.
A case officer. To keep tabs on them.
To assess their integration, to maintain contact, and to make sure they aren't a security risk. It's a system designed specifically to mitigate the exact kind of threat this incident seems to represent.
So the protocols exist, they are on the books.
Yes, but the reports allege that when Kabul collapsed, that entire system, it just evaporated overnight. That's a quote from one of the sources.
Evaporated.
Because the evacuation was a mad dash, the documentation required to even trigger these protocols was missing. These highly sensitive people were being rushed onto planes with, and I'm quoting again, almost zero documentation.
Incomplete lists, missing files.
Exactly. The very paperwork that would flag someone as high risk requires monitoring may have never existed or was lost in the chaos.
Okay, so that's the failure at the point of origin, a catastrophic failure of paperwork. But what about once they got here? To the U.S., did anyone pick up the ball then?
That's the second half of the problem, and the reports here are, frankly, damning. They indicate a near-total collapse of any structured follow-up.
No case officers were assigned.
Allegedly, no. No mandatory integration assessments, no long-term monitoring, nothing was put in place despite the obvious operational sensitivity of their backgrounds.
So these individuals, who by their very nature require the highest levels of surveillance, were just released.
The sources say they simply disappeared into the population.
That is a chilling phrase.
It is. They became internal phantoms. They went from being closely managed assets in a war zone to being completely unmonitored individuals living inside the United States.
And that raises the big, terrifying question.
If Lakenwall, with his known intelligence links, could slip completely off the radar, how many more are out there?
How many other people with similar training, similar backgrounds, and no monitoring have also just vanished into the general population?
That's the question that is keeping national security officials up at night. This wasn't just a bureaucratic error. This was a fundamental breach. The decision to prioritize speed over these critical security protocols has now, allegedly, come home to roost in the most violent way imaginable.
The ultimate fear is the unmonitored operative.
Precisely. Someone with specialized skills and contacts operating domestically, completely outside of the surveillance framework that was designed to contain them. And the sources suggest this wasn't some unavoidable accident. It was a foreseeable result of the choices made in 2021.
And as if all of that wasn't enough, the failed vetting, the security breaches. The reports from 2021 detail another scandal, a moral and legal scandal that was allegedly buried by the media.
Yes, this part of the story highlights a completely different but equally disturbing challenge that came from that chaotic intake.
We're talking about the arrival of Afghan family units that included child brides.
Correct. The reports document multiple instances of this. Girls, some as young as their early teens, arriving in the U.S. alongside older adult men, brought in under the guise of family reunification.
Which creates an immediate and profound conflict with U.S. law.
A massive conflict. Once you are on U.S. soil, you are under U.S. law. And in most states, a sexual relationship with a minor is statutory rape. Full stop. The cultural context becomes irrelevant legally.
So what did U.S. officials do? They were surely aware of this.
The sources say State Department officials were pressed on this exact point. Were they arresting the adult men? Were they putting the minors into protective custody?
Those seem like the only two logical options under our laws.
You would think so. But the response that was cited in the reports was, well, it was deeply troubling.
They didn't confirm arrests or protections.
No. Instead, they reportedly said they would make case-by-case recommendations evaluating the length of the marriage and the cultural context.
Evaluating the cultural context of what is considered a felony in the United States.
That's the phrase that set off so many alarm bells. It suggests that for the sake of diplomatic optics or political convenience, they were willing to consider legitimizing behavior that is explicitly illegal here.
The sources called this a moral collapse, disguised as diplomacy.
They also called it reckless intake at any cost. The allegation is that the priority was to keep the evacuation moving, to keep the humanitarian narrative clean, even if it meant compromising the most basic legal and moral protections for children on our own soil.
And the policy failure didn't end at the border.
No, because once these family units were dispersed across the country, local officials faced a huge dilemma.
If they prosecute the man, they are admitting a crime occurred under a U.S. government program.
Which would have destroyed the pristine public image of Operation Allies Welcome. Critics feel it would have been a political catastrophe for the administration.
And this brings us to the alleged media silence on this. The reports claim this story was aggressively smothered. Why?
The sources argue it was a strategic decision. It was about protecting the narrative.
The narrative of a purely heroic humanitarian mission.
Exactly. Admitting that the operation also inadvertently imported child exploitation would have completely undermined that. It would have confirmed that the whole endeavor was far more chaotic and morally compromised than they were letting on.
So the alleged media silence wasn't an accident. It was a choice.
It was a choice, according to these sources, to prioritize the political narrative over accountability, even when the safety of minors was at stake.
Okay, so now let's move forward to the political fallout from the ambush in D.C. Because the reaction was, well, it was immediate and it was starkly polarized.
A complete split. On one side, you had the current administration, which reports say was dodging and deflecting, trying to manage the fallout. And on the other, you had former President Trump,
who had an immediate and very decisive response.
It was a stark contrast in leadership styles. While one side was reportedly struggling with how to handle the identity leak, President Trump came out and classified the attack for what the sources say it was.
An act of terror.
An act of terror carried out by someone who, because of a failed system, should never have been in the country in the first place. He didn't mince words.
And he didn't stop at just condemning it. He announced a major policy proposal.
A huge one. It was immediately dubbed the Hammer. He called for a full pause on migration from all third-world countries.
A full pause.
Effective immediately. And the pause would remain in effect until, in his words, a new ironclad vetting system is completed.
He was essentially proposing to shut the system down and rebuild it from scratch to eliminate the very loopholes that allowed this to happen.
That was the goal. His proposal was very specific. No more loopholes, no more ambiguous parole categories that let people bypass the deep SIV checks, no more processing exemptions for any reason.
So this ironclad system was more than just a slogan for him. He laid out the policy points.
Yes, the core of it was rebuilding the screening architecture so that security professionals, not political appointees, had to sign off on every single applicant, confirming their entire history is verifiable before they are allowed in.
The message was unambiguous.
Protect the American people first. And if the current system can't do that, then the system has to stop until it can. It completely reset the national debate.
It forced the conversation away from defending the 2021 evacuation and toward demanding real, verifiable security reform.
Which put immense pressure on the current administration to defend a system that had, just hours before, allegedly failed in the most spectacular way possible.
But the moment that announcement was made, the migration freeze, the progressive political world had a meltdown.
An absolute implosion, as the reports described it. The reaction was immediate and intensely negative.
The order was called racist, fascist, authoritarian.
All the usual language. But the sources point out a pretty significant contradiction in that response.
Which was?
These were often the very same voices that had spent years attacking the National Guard, demonizing ICE, calling border agents white supremacists. But suddenly, when two of those service members were shot,
That fact seemed to get minimized.
the focus wasn't on the victims. The priority, it seemed, was narrative survival. Instead of admitting that the vetting system had collapsed, the response from Democrats was reportedly to lock arms and defend Operation Allies Welcome at any cost.
So they defended the very program that allegedly allowed this to happen.
They framed it as a sacred humanitarian achievement, ignoring the alleged policy gaps that led directly to the security breach. The defense was purely ideological. It wasn't based on an assessment of the facts on the ground.
And while the political class was reacting, the online response was something else entirely. It was genuinely disturbing.
It really highlights a level of radicalization that is, well, it's pretty profound. The sources say that within minutes of the suspect's identity becoming public, certain extremist accounts on social media began to celebrate the attack.
Celebrate it.
Yes, calling it a wake-up call, praising the perpetrator. And then there were these sick inside jokes. One chilling reference that was noted was a joke that the guardsman had been K-keyed.
Okay, we need to explain that for our listeners. This is some very online, very esoteric jargon, but the sources say it's important.
It is important context. The term KKE refers to a prior, very high-profile assassination attempt against conservative commentator.
So using it as a joke here.
It implies that some of these radical voices saw the attack on the guardsmen not as a crime, but as a political victory, as a continuation of violence against their perceived political enemies.
And these weren't just anonymous trolls in a basement.
No, the reports indicate these were verified accounts. Influencers, activists.
So how do the sources connect this kind of behavior to the broader political climate?
They analyze it as a direct consequence of years of sustained extreme rhetoric. Their argument is when you have a political movement and its allies in the media spending years labeling soldiers, police, and conservatives as Nazis or domestic terrorists,
You create a framework.
you create an ideological framework where violence against those groups starts to seem justified to people on the fringe. They stop seeing it as a criminal act and start seeing it as a form of righteous resistance.
So they weren't seeing two American service members. They were seeing symbols of the oppressor in uniform that the rhetoric had trained them to see.
Precisely. The sources argue that while the rhetoric didn't pull the trigger, it absolutely created the political and social environment where celebrating the shooting felt acceptable, even laudable, to a radicalized few.
It's the idea that words have consequences.
And these words, according to the sources, have been lighting fuses all over the political map for years.
So you have this dynamic. A horrifying attack, a political class defending the failed system, and online radicals celebrating the violence. And that led to a third crucial reaction.
A potential political awakening among the people in the middle, the moderates.
This could be the most significant political outcome of all. How did this happen?
Well, you have to put yourself in their shoes. Millions of ordinary Americans, many of them moderate Democrats, people who are not ideologically radical, they saw all of this unfold.
They saw the ambush, they saw the policy failure, they saw the online celebration.
And they saw the two competing responses from leadership. They saw one side deflecting and dodging, and they saw former President Trump respond with immediate, decisive action demanding better security.
And for these moderates, that sequence of events crystallized something.
It crystallized a harsh truth, according to the sources. It looked like one side was clearly prioritizing the protection of Americans first, while the other side seemed more concerned with protecting its own political narrative, even after a catastrophic failure.
And there was polling data to back this up.
Yes, the polling indicators cited showed a huge surge in support for Trump's proposed migration freeze, and a sharp rise among independent voters demanding stricter, verifiable vetting.
So the attack served as a wake-up call, but not in the way the online radicals intended.
Exactly. It was a turning point. It made the abstract debate about vetting failures from 2021 terrifyingly real. It crystallized everything that was allegedly wrong with that rushed process.
And at the same time, it highlighted this massive public demand for leadership that is focused on national security above all else.
The sources conclude this was far more than just a crime. It was a political earthquake. And it might just be the event that reshapes the next election, putting national security and immigration integrity right back at the center of the debate. Thank you. And thank you to our listeners.
That's all for this deep dive into the sources surrounding the National Guard ambush. But it leaves us with one haunting question. If the guardians of the rules are the first to break them, who is left to protect the game?